Tonight, we follow lines of ink that were never meant to be seen. Coastlines drawn centuries too early, islands that appear and vanish, meridians shifted like stage props. These are not just maps. They are keys to a version of history the Vatican has worked tirelessly to keep sealed. For hundreds of years, the Church has claimed to guide humanity through darkness. But beneath the marble floors of Rome lie drawers filled with forbidden charts, maps that prove the world was known long before it was discovered. They reveal rivers erased, voyages disguised as miracles, and civilizations stripped from memory. This is not about parchment gathering dust. It is about a geography edited to serve power, a world redrawn to fit theology. And the mapmakers who dared to show too much, silenced, reassigned, or forgotten. If these maps are real, then church history itself sits on shifting ground. Every mission, every bull, every triumph rests on coastlines they hid from the world. So, before you think this is just a tale of old charts, ask yourself, what if the world you know is already an edited version, designed not to guide you but to keep you lost? Like the video, subscribe, because tonight we open the drawers, and the maps inside could rewrite everything. A map appears where no map should exist. A yellowed piece of parchment showing coastlines that, according to our history, were not discovered until hundreds of years later. The ink lines curve with a precision that should have been impossible before the invention of advanced navigation tools. South America stretches down the page, Antarctica peeks out free of ice, and tiny islands speckle the Atlantic like breadcrumbs. At first glance, it looks like a mistake, but the more you stare, the more one question gnaws at your mind. Who drew it, and why did the world forget it existed? We are taught that the age of discovery began in the 15th century, with explorers like Christopher Columbus, Vasco da Gama, and Ferdinand Magellan. Schoolbooks say that before then, Europeans wandered blind, convinced the oceans ended in cliffs, or that sea monsters devoured ships whole. Yet here lies a map dated long before those voyages, etched with details only someone who had actually seen those coasts could know. The mystery is not only that the map exists, but that it should not exist at all. Some scholars whisper that it was compiled from fragments of older charts, passed secretly from hand to hand through monks, merchants, and navigators who dared to sail farther than the church allowed. Others claim the knowledge came from lost civilizations, whose memory has been erased. What is certain is this: if the map is real, it means human history has been staged. That what we believe about the discovery of the world may be nothing more than a carefully curated script. Imagine the impact of such knowledge in the Middle Ages. If a chart showed that beyond the Atlantic lay entire continents, gold-rich lands, and untouched resources, whoever controlled that parchment controlled the future. But instead of releasing it to the public, the parchment disappeared into the deep stone vaults of the Vatican, sealed behind walls where daylight has never touched, categorized under the term secretum, meaning private, not for the eyes of ordinary men. Why would the Church hide such a thing? Power rests not only on armies or wealth, but on stories. If people believed that the Earth had been fully mapped centuries before Columbus, then the heroes celebrated in every history book would crumble into footnotes. The myth of divine guidance, leading brave explorers across unknown seas, would collapse. And worse, the Vatican's authority as the keeper of truth would be questioned. For an institution that built its image on guiding mankind from darkness into light, admitting that others already held the light was too dangerous. So the map was silenced, copies were confiscated, sources erased, and the narrative rewritten. Instead of remembering forgotten cartographers, the world was taught to praise the sanctioned explorers. The names of those who drew the first true lines across the oceans vanished, replaced by saints, miracles, and tales of divine providence. Yet, every now and then, one of these forbidden maps resurfaces, a trunk in a Lisbon library, a forgotten page in a monastery, or a fragment tucked in the margin of a Latin manuscript. Each time it appears, it poses the same question. How much of what we call discovery was really rediscovery, and how much was stolen knowledge hidden until the moment was convenient? This is why a simple sheet of parchment can feel more dangerous than a sword. It is proof that the world has been known longer than we admit, that the oceans were crossed before we were told, that the Vatican may not have preserved truth, but edited it. And if one map can vanish for centuries only to reappear, how many more lie buried beneath stone, waiting to redraw not just coastlines, but history itself? Beneath the marble floors of St. Two, Peter's Basilica, there is a silence so deep it feels alive. At night, the great halls above glow with gold and candlelight, but down in the archive tunnels only the scratching of pens and the shuffling of parchment disturb the air. The Vatican employs men and women whose names you will never know, tasked with cataloguing millions of documents stretching back over 1,000 years. Among them was a quiet archivist, a man whose work was so repetitive that his life seemed to blur into the endless drawers of cards he handled. One night, while filing a set of entries, his hand paused on a card that looked different. The handwriting was older, the ink browned with age. Across its surface were two words that should not have been there: Cosmographiae Vetustissimi, ancient cosmographies. At first, he thought it was nothing. The Vatican archives are filled with references in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. But when he checked the public index, the entry was missing. No mention of these cosmographies existed in the official records that scholars were allowed to see. That was strange. Every card was supposed to match a corresponding listing, even for restricted items. The archivist frowned and slipped the card into his stack, but the phrase kept burning in his mind. Ancient cosmographies. What did that mean? The word cosmographia in the Middle Ages referred not only to maps, but to complete descriptions of the world. Geography mixed with astronomy, myths, and navigation notes. To claim that these were Vetustissimi, the most ancient, meant they might contain knowledge from long before Europe was supposed to have mapped the globe. If the archivist was correct, these catalogue entries pointed to documents that should not exist at all, maps that predated the age of discovery by centuries. Curiosity began to stir inside him, though he knew curiosity was dangerous in these halls. The Vatican trained its archivists to file without asking questions, to serve the order of the archive rather than the truth of its contents. Still, he slipped back to the drawer later that night, when the supervisors had gone. His candle flickered as he checked the nearby cards. Some were ordinary references to papal letters or decrees, but again and again he noticed gaps. Whole ranges of catalogue numbers skipped as if erased, and in their place only a few cryptic notes remained, written in the same hand. Cosmographiae Vetustissimi. No authors listed, no dates, no descriptions. What chilled him most was a faint pencil mark in the margin of one card. A single word, erased but still visible under the light. Tabulae. Tables. It could only mean charts or maps. His heart began to race. He realised what this suggested. Somewhere in the endless vaults beneath St. Nine, Peter's, hidden behind layers of locked doors and permissions no archivist could ever reach, there were maps so ancient that even the official catalogue denied their existence. That night, he returned home restless. He had not seen the maps, only the cards. Yet he felt as though he had stumbled into forbidden territory. For if the Church kept entire maps hidden even from its own scholars, what did they reveal? Coastlines centuries too early, continents unacknowledged, routes across oceans long before Columbus. The archivist knew better than to speak of it. Still, in his journal, he scribbled a single note before blowing out his lamp. Cosmographiae Vetustissimi. The oldest world maps, and he wondered how many other drawers whispered secrets no one was meant to find. A map may look like harmless lines of ink on paper, but in truth it is one of the most powerful weapons humanity has ever created. A sword can cut down a man, but a map can claim entire continents. From the moment rulers understood that to name a place was to own it, maps became tools of empire. A blank space on a chart was never just an unknown land, it was an invitation to conquer. And once a line was drawn, no matter who lived there, the world accepted that the land belonged to whoever held the pen. History shows this again and again. When the Roman Empire expanded, surveyors marched beside soldiers. They did not only build roads, they measured the land and wrote its names into their records. To Rome, those names meant ownership. Later, during the 15th and 16th centuries, Spain and Portugal carved the globe between them with the stroke of a pen on a treaty, because their maps said they could. Entire nations were divided by imaginary lines no one on the ground had ever seen. The people living there were never asked. Maps are not objective truths. They are stories told by those in power. What appears on them is often less important than what is missing. Omit a city and it vanishes from memory. Ignore a culture and it never existed in the eyes of history. This is why empires guarded their charts like treasure. To possess them was to control not only trade routes, but the very shape of reality. A coastline on a secret map could be the difference between poverty and untold riches. A misplaced island could start a war. The Vatican understood this better than anyone. Long before the printing press spread books across Europe, the Church was already the custodian of ancient manuscripts, maps included. With monasteries stretching from Ireland to the Holy Land, it had access to fragments of knowledge from nearly every corner of the known world. By deciding which maps were copied, which were locked away, and which were quietly burned, the Church could steer the story of exploration without ever setting sail. If a voyage had already happened, erasing its chart was enough to make it disappear from history. If a discovery had not yet been made, keeping a map hidden meant the Church could decide who would receive it and when. Think of the power in that silence. An explorer might be celebrated for discovering a new world, but if an older chart already showed that coastline, then what was he really discovering? Perhaps nothing more than knowledge that had been withheld until it was convenient. In this way, the Church and the empires that served it learned to control time itself, dictating when the world would be revealed. To the ordinary person, a map was simply a guide, a way to travel from one town to another. But to rulers and popes, it was destiny. Ink defined borders, created kingdoms, and erased whole peoples. A map is never neutral. It is always an argument, a claim, a weapon disguised as parchment. And the Vatican, sitting quietly at the crossroads of faith and empire, knew how to wield that weapon better than anyone. Words are powerful. They can create belief, erase doubt, and shield entire worlds of knowledge behind a single phrase. The Vatican understood this better than anyone, and that is why they never called their archive secret. Instead, they used the Latin word secretum, which, in their defense, they claimed did not mean hidden, but private. It was a clever play on language, one that allowed them to deny accusations of censorship, while still locking the doors to countless shelves of human history. When challenged about why so many documents could not be accessed, Church officials would smile and explain that nothing was forbidden, only restricted for the sake of preservation. They said the vaults were private collections, like the personal library of a pope, not a public museum. In other words, they did not have to reveal anything they did not wish to, because technically it was theirs alone. With that small twist of meaning, centuries of records disappeared from view. What might have been labelled suppression could now be excused as caretaking. This is how the secretum defence worked. By hiding behind words, the Church created an invisible wall. Scholars could knock, but they would never enter unless given rare permission, and even then only to see carefully chosen pieces. When asked about documents that had been whispered about for generations, officials would shrug. There is nothing secret here, they would insist. If you cannot find what you are looking for, perhaps it does not exist at all. But the truth is that private can be far more dangerous than secret. A secret admits it is something withheld. Privacy suggests innocence, a simple matter of ownership, yet behind those walls lay maps, letters, astronomical records, and manuscripts that could change everything we know about history. By calling them private, the Church stripped away the urgency of questions. After all, who dares to demand the contents of another person's private belongings? Think about the effect this had on generations of scholars. Many accepted the explanation and moved on, fearing to push too far against the most powerful institution in Europe. Others who doubted found themselves discredited, mocked as conspiracy theorists long before the word existed. The Vatican did not need to burn every book or imprison every thinker. It only needed to let the word private hang in the air like a shield. The silence that followed would take care of the rest. This defense continues, even in modern times. Researchers are allowed glimpses into the archive, but always under strict rules. They can request a single document, but only if they already know exactly what to ask for. They cannot wander freely through the shelves. They cannot make copies at will. They are permitted to see only what the guardians of the archive allow. And so, while the Church proudly declares that nothing is truly secret, the world still has no idea how much lies hidden behind those ancient stone walls. In the end, the secretum defense is not about preservation, it is about control. By reshaping the meaning of one word, the Vatican built a fortress stronger than steel, a place where knowledge could vanish without ever being called forbidden. It is a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous chains are not iron, but language. And the most effective lock is the one we never notice, because we have already accepted it as normal. There is a story whispered among archivists, and passed along by architects who once worked inside the Vatican's oldest halls. They speak of a room that officially does not exist, a chamber built not to be entered but to be sealed. It is said to lie beneath the lowest vaults, deeper than the catalogued archives, a sub-vault dedicated entirely to what the Church once called the tabulae orbis, the world tables. According to rumour, this hidden chamber was sealed during the Counter-Reformation in the 16th century and has not been opened since. The idea of a room without a door sounds like legend, but architectural records hint at irregular spaces under St. Peter's. Old blueprints show corridors that lead to blank walls and staircases that descend only to vanish into stone. Some scholars believe these are not accidents of construction, but deliberate designs to conceal entire rooms from prying eyes. If true, the map room without a door may still be down there, untouched for centuries, holding cartographic treasures never meant to be seen again. Why would the Church build such a place? The Counter-Reformation was a time of great fear for the Vatican. Protestant reformers accused Rome of corruption and secrecy, demanding transparency and access to knowledge. In response, the Church tightened its grip on every scrap of information it possessed. Anything that could threaten its authority was hidden away, and maps were among the most dangerous. A map showing continents unknown to common Europe, or coastlines drawn too early, would have raised questions the Church could not answer, without exposing its role as gatekeeper. Witnesses from the 17th century wrote vaguely about a collection of ancient charts stored in a chamber so restricted that even many cardinals had never seen it. They described it as a library of maps gathered from fallen empires, from Greek scholars, Arab navigators, and perhaps civilizations even older. These were not displayed or copied. They were locked away, the door sealed, and the location erased from official records. If they still exist, they would represent the most complete hidden atlas of the world ever assembled. Some modern engineers who worked on renovations near the archive report strange anomalies. Their instruments detect hollow spaces where none should be, and walls that sound different when tapped. But whenever these reports surface, Vatican officials dismiss them as mistakes or forbid further investigation. The rumours grow stronger each time, feeding the belief that beneath those stone floors lies the map room without a door, sealed since the days when Europe was rewriting its faith and its history. Imagine stepping inside that chamber. Dust thick in the air, parchment stacked on oak tables, globes cracked with age. Maps showing the world as it was once truly known, unfiltered, uncensored, untouched by centuries of editing. Perhaps coastlines of Antarctica, drawn in an age when it was still green. Perhaps islands long lost beneath rising seas. Perhaps trade routes erased from memory because they contradicted the story of discovery we are taught today. If such a place exists, then the silence of its sealed walls is more than stone. It is the silence of stolen centuries. The map room without a door is not just a legend of architecture. It is a metaphor for how far power will go to guard its version of the world. And until the day someone breaks through those walls, the truth of what lies in the tabulae orbis remains locked away, hidden beneath the city of Rome, where even whispers cannot pass through the stone. When you stare at some of the oldest maps in existence, something unsettling begins to appear. Coastlines drawn centuries before explorers were supposed to have reached them. Archipelagos scattered across oceans long before official voyages charted them. Even Antarctica, not discovered until the 19th century, sketched as if its shores were visible and its ice stripped away. These are the lines before discovery, the traces of knowledge that history insists should not exist. One of the most famous examples is the Piri Reis map of 1513, compiled in Constantinople by an Ottoman admiral. It shows parts of South America with surprising accuracy. But what shocked researchers most was a portion of Antarctica drawn as though it were free of ice. According to geologists, Antarctica has been frozen solid for thousands of years. How could a map from the 16th century depict something no sailor could have seen? Some suggest it was copied from charts made long before recorded history. Fragments passed secretly from civilization to civilization until they reached the admiral's hands. Other maps contain similar anomalies. In European composite charts from the Middle Ages, small clusters of islands appear in the middle of the Atlantic, positioned with exact longitudes and latitudes. Some of these match seamounts discovered only with modern sonar. Others mark land that no longer exists, swallowed by the ocean, or perhaps erased deliberately to protect the myth of later discovery. Each time one of these islands is found, the official story must bend, claiming coincidence or error. Yet the lines match too closely to be dismissed. Even more troubling is the matter of longitude. Before the 18th century, it is said no sailor could measure longitude accurately at sea. That is why voyages often lost track of their true positions. Yet, many medieval maps show corrected longitudes, coastlines aligned almost perfectly with modern data. How could that be? Did forgotten instruments exist, knowledge of celestial navigation suppressed for centuries? Or were mapmakers working from sources far older, sources that already held the key to the globe? These mysteries circle back to the Vatican. The Church gathered maps from conquered lands, from scholars fleeing collapsing empires, from sailors who handed over their charts in exchange for safety or favour. Once inside the vaults, these maps were copied, altered, or hidden. The anomalies remained visible only in fragments that slipped out into the world. The most accurate or most troubling examples were never allowed to circulate freely. They vanished behind walls, where no one could compare them with official discoveries. The effect was simple, but devastating. When explorers like Columbus sailed west, they were hailed as visionaries braving the unknown. Yet some believe they carried charts already showing where land could be found. If true, then the voyages were not leaps into darkness, but carefully guided steps along routes known to a select few. Discovery becomes rediscovery, and the myth of heroic chance collapses into a story of withheld knowledge. The lines before discovery are more than ink. They are fingerprints of a history that has been edited, reminders that the world was mapped long before textbooks admit. Each anomalous coastline, Each vanished island, each corrected longitude, is a clue pointing to a larger truth that someone knew, someone drew, and someone decided to hide it until the time was right. In the quiet cloisters of medieval Europe, monks bent over parchment, not only to copy scripture, but to record something stranger, lines of coasts, wind roses, and directions whispered from sailors who passed their monasteries. While history tells us these holy men were only concerned with prayer and devotion, scattered evidence suggests that some monasteries doubled as hidden seafaring schools, places where knowledge of the oceans was gathered, preserved, and locked away. These were not official explorers, celebrated in crowns and armour. They were men in robes, quietly keeping the world in ink. The tradition of portolan charts emerged in the 13th century with sudden brilliance. Unlike earlier symbolic maps that placed Jerusalem at the centre of a flat earth, portolans were astonishingly accurate. They showed the Mediterranean and the Black Sea with such precision that modern researchers have compared them with satellite images and found barely a mistake, yet no one explains how this leap in accuracy appeared out of nowhere. Did monks, cloistered away from cities, somehow become the unseen navigators of their age? There are hints that monasteries along the coasts of Italy, Spain, and even Ireland received more than relics from travellers. Sailors left offerings of stories, routes, and sketches of the lands they saw. These details were copied into books that looked like devotional works, but contained diagrams of stars, tidal notes, and coastal outlines hidden in the margins. A monk could preach from the pulpit by day and chart winds by candlelight at night. To him, the sea was not only God's creation, but a manuscript waiting to be translated. Some chronicles tell of monks setting sail themselves. The voyage of St. Brendan, described in the 9th century, tells of an Irish abbot who crossed the Atlantic, encountering islands filled with birds, seas full of crystal, and shores of unknown lands. Officially, it is written off as legend, but many scholars wonder if the tale disguises an actual voyage that carried back real geographic knowledge. The so-called miraculous descriptions may have been poetic codes for places Brendan's followers reached. If that is true, then the earliest atlases of the Atlantic may have been crafted in monasteries centuries before Columbus was born. The Vatican had every reason to encourage such hidden cartography. The more monks gathered and recorded, the more the Church could claim guardianship over the knowledge of creation. But it also had reason to keep it hidden. If the common world learned that far coasts were already charted, the myth of Europe as a dark continent awaiting light would collapse. So the navigator's gospel remained unspoken, its lines confined to secret manuscripts, its accuracy attributed to miracles rather than method. Portolan charts survive today in fragments scattered across libraries, but many are missing, their provenance erased. It is possible the most revealing examples never left the stone walls of the Vatican archive. And so the mystery deepens. Were cloistered scholars simply scribes of prayer, or were they the quiet custodians of a truer map of the world? The answer may lie not in the seas that were sailed, but in the Gospels that were never read aloud, maps inked with devotion, yet destined to remain unseen. History is filled with names of saints and martyrs, but far fewer names of the men who actually sailed the seas and built the machines that made exploration possible. Somewhere along the way, the engineers and pilots who risked their lives to chart unknown waters vanished from the record. In their place rose miracle stories of holy men calming storms with a prayer or guiding ships by divine light. It was not ignorance that erased the captains, it was choice. By replacing them with saints, the Church rewrote voyages into legends and stripped them of coordinates, reducing the world's greatest journeys to tales of faith rather than feats of skill. Consider the Mediterranean in the early Middle Ages. Merchant fleets carried goods across hundreds of miles of open sea. Skilled pilots used complex instruments to read the stars and currents. Yet their names are forgotten. Instead, we hear of St. Nicholas, the patron of sailors, calming waves and saving ships from disaster. Was it coincidence that the same period when accurate portolan maps began to appear is the period when stories of miraculous maritime saints multiplied? Perhaps not. By giving credit to saints rather than sailors, the Church could claim ownership of every successful voyage without admitting that human knowledge had already advanced far beyond what they allowed the world to believe. The pattern repeats across Europe. In Spain and Portugal, tales tell of storms vanishing after priests raised crosses over the decks. In Ireland, legends say monks sailed west, guided only by their psalms. Yet behind these pious accounts, there must have been navigators, writing logs, noting wind directions, recording distances, and measuring the angle of the sun. Those records are almost entirely gone. Pilot books that should have existed for centuries are missing, burned, or buried in monasteries. The miracles remain, the data does not. Even when voyages are remembered, they are written as allegories. The story of St. Brendan's journey across the Atlantic describes islands of crystal and seas of fire. Historians dismiss it as myth, but what if those fantastical images were poetic disguises for icebergs, volcanoes, or new continents? If the pilot logs of Brendan's crew had survived, perhaps the story would read like an early chart of the Atlantic. Instead, the details were erased, the journey sanctified, and the real captains vanished into legend. Why would this erasure happen? The answer is control. If people believed voyages succeeded through engineering, astronomy, and calculation, they might begin to trust human reason over divine guidance. But if every success at sea was credited to God and his saints, the Church remained central. The ocean became a pulpit, and the ship a moving chapel. Knowledge of navigation could be confined to the monasteries and released only when convenient. Today, the silence is louder than ever. We find fragments of instruments from shipwrecks, charts that suggest advanced understanding of longitude, and traces of voyages that contradict official timelines. Yet the names of those who made them are gone. The erased captains are the missing witnesses of history, replaced by saints who never held a compass. Their voices may never return, but their absence is proof that someone decided long ago that miracles would be remembered and men would be forgotten. Longitude has always been called the sailor's curse. While latitude can be found by measuring the height of the sun or stars above the horizon, longitude requires knowing the precise time, and without accurate clocks, early navigators were supposedly helpless. Textbooks repeat the same story. For centuries, men guessed, stumbled, and lost themselves at sea until the invention of the marine chronometer in the 18th century finally solved the problem. But when you look closely at the charts that survive from the so-called Dark Ages, you see something strange. Coastlines are drawn with longitudes far more accurate than they should be. How could this be? If no one could calculate longitude, how did mapmakers place harbours and islands in their correct east and west positions? Some suggest it was luck, or clever copying from later maps, but others see it as evidence of a silent century when longitude was known, used, and then erased. The clues are small but unsettling. Portolan maps from the 13th century align with surprising precision to modern data. Composite charts from even earlier centuries show corrected positions that no guessing could achieve. Someone had the tools or data to measure longitude long before the official invention of the chronometer. What instruments could they have used? One theory is that monks and scholars possessed devices now lost to us, primitive versions of clocks regulated by the stars or pendulums accurate enough to keep time at sea. Others believe they relied on astronomical tables, predicting eclipses and lunar positions to anchor their charts in time. If that knowledge existed, it would have been extremely dangerous. To measure longitude was to control the oceans, to know not only where you were, but where you were going. Whoever had that power could dominate trade, exploration, and war. This may explain why the traces of that knowledge vanish so suddenly. By the 15th century, the story is rewritten. Navigators are once again portrayed as hopeless without divine providence, their charts full of wild guesses, their voyages guided only by faith. The long silence about longitude became a convenient myth, one that kept power in the hands of the Church and the monarchs who depended on it. If the common world believed longitude was unsolvable, then only those granted access to forbidden charts could truly navigate. Even the way discoveries are described raises questions. Columbus, in 1492, is said to have stumbled upon the New World by chance, yet some of his logs hint at knowledge of distances and directions, too precise for a man sailing blind. Did he have access to hidden data preserved in monastic vaults, showing routes that were already known? If so, then the age of discovery was not discovery at all, but the unveiling of information delayed for centuries. The silence around longitude is not a gap in human ability, it is a gap in memory, a century or more where evidence points to hidden instruments and secret data that textbooks refuse to acknowledge. The maps tell us what the history books do not. Someone knew how to find longitude, someone used it, and then, as if on command, the knowledge disappeared, leaving us with a story that makes the past look darker and the Church's light brighter than it truly was. Medieval Europe was once convinced the world could be drawn with a single circle and a simple cross. These were the T and O maps, crude diagrams showing the Earth as a flat disk divided into three parts. Asia at the top, Europe on one side, Africa on the other, and Jerusalem in the centre as the heart of creation. They were not meant to guide travellers, but to preach a vision of the world where theology shaped geography. Oceans were mere lines, rivers were boundaries, and unknown lands simply did not exist. For centuries, this was the official image of the world, reproduced in manuscripts and hung in monasteries as a reminder that faith defined reality. Then, almost without warning, something changed. By the 13th century, a new kind of chart appeared. The portolan, gone, were the flat discs and sermon-like symbols. In their place were maps that looked startlingly modern. The Mediterranean and Black Sea coastlines were drawn with breathtaking accuracy, every curve and inlet in the right place, every harbour carefully marked. Straight lines, known as rhumb lines, spread like spider webs across the parchment, showing directions that sailors could follow with precision. The leap from T and O maps to portolans was so sudden it defies explanation. How did Europe jump from childlike doodles to professional navigation tools that still impress experts today? Historians try to explain it by saying practical sailors simply replaced church scribes, but this answer feels hollow. The accuracy of portolans suggests a massive store of data, gathered over centuries and compiled with skill that goes far beyond guesswork. No record describes such a long effort. No gradual improvement connects the crude T and O diagrams to the refined portolans. It is as if the knowledge appeared fully formed, dropped into the laps of mapmakers by an invisible hand. Some believe the missing link lies in the Vatican archives. While public Europe drew circles around Jerusalem, the Church may have quietly collected true maps from Arab traders, Byzantine scholars, and forgotten civilizations. By hiding them, it could preserve the illusion of ignorance, then reveal more advanced charts only when it served their power. The T and O maps kept people humble and dependent on divine guidance, while the portolans, restricted to sailors tied to church-approved patrons, allowed controlled expansion into the seas. The jump is too sharp to ignore. 1 century a child in a monastery could learn geography from a circle with a cross. The next, a navigator could cross the Mediterranean with a chart so accurate it could rival satellite images. That is not natural progress. That is the sudden unveiling of knowledge that had been kept hidden until the right moment. Between T and O maps and portolans lies a silence, a gap where history pretends nothing happened. But in that gap may be the evidence of erased cartographers, stolen data, or ancient charts locked away. The leap is not a mystery of genius, it is a sign of control. A reminder that the story of maps, like the story of history itself, may have been carefully edited to keep the truth hidden, just long enough for power to decide when the world was finally allowed to be known. In the margins of medieval manuscripts, there are clues that the maps of Europe were never fully European at all. Tiny notes in Arabic script, fragments of Greek phrases, and even Chinese characters slip between the Latin text like fingerprints of forgotten teachers. These traces suggest that what we call the rise of European cartography may not have been invention, but translation, knowledge borrowed from civilizations that had already mastered the horizons. The Arab world in the 9th and 10th centuries was alive with astronomy and geography. Scholars like Al-Idrisi compiled maps that stretched from Spain to China, using reports from travelers, merchants, and sailors. His world map of 1154 showed rivers, mountains, and coastlines with detail unmatched in Europe for centuries. Byzantine scholars preserved ancient Greek works, passing on Ptolemy's geography with its grid system of latitude and longitude. In China, dynasties produced maps carved into stone and silk that displayed entire trade networks with precision. Yet in European schools of the same era, students were still shown T and O diagrams, flat circles dominated by Jerusalem. The puzzle deepens when you study later maps that emerged from European monasteries. Margins filled with odd references that do not match Latin tradition. An Arabic name for a port, scribbled next to a Latin one. A coastline drawn in the Chinese style with exaggerated rivers. A Byzantine star symbol inserted beside a list of harbours. It is as though the maps were stitched together from fragments, pieces of knowledge funneled into Latin hands, but never openly credited to their original sources. Why would this knowledge be hidden? The answer lies in authority. To admit that Europe's maps came from Islamic or Eastern scholars would have shattered the Church's claim of guiding civilization out of darkness. Instead, foreign knowledge was absorbed quietly, rebranded as rediscovery, and released only when it fit the narrative of divine providence. The horizon was borrowed, but the credit was rewritten. Traders along the Mediterranean almost certainly carried charts and oral directions that made their way into monasteries. Pilgrims brought back manuscripts from Byzantium. Jesuits, returning from China in later centuries, smuggled entire atlases disguised as theological texts. Each piece of information was copied, translated into Latin, and tucked into the archives. By the time it reappeared, it no longer bore the name of its true creator. It was now part of Europe's own story, claimed as a sudden leap of genius rather than the quiet borrowing it truly was. This rewriting matters because it shows how history itself can be bent. If maps were not the product of isolated brilliance, but of hidden exchange, then the entire tale of European discovery changes. The age of exploration becomes not a moment of sudden awakening, but the result of centuries of borrowed horizons, carefully filtered through church control. The monks who copied the notes left the evidence in their margins, perhaps not realizing that centuries later, their small scribbles would betray the truth. That the world Europe claimed to discover had already been drawn by other hands long before and hidden beneath Latin ink. Sometimes history hides not in the grand texts, but in the smallest scribbles. In one forgotten manuscript copied by a monk in the 13th century, a marginal note appears beside a map of the Mediterranean. It reads only 2 words in Latin, ex antiquis chartis, meaning from ancient charts. At first glance, it looks like nothing, just a casual reference. But those 2 words open a door into a world of questions far larger than the parchment itself. What ancient charts was the monk referring to? None survive in the record. The standard story says medieval Europe had little more than symbolic diagrams until the sudden appearance of portolan maps. Yet here was a monk admitting that his work came not from divine inspiration or contemporary sailors, but from older sources already in existence. The marginal note was a confession. The knowledge was not new. It was inherited. The Church would have preferred silence. If every accurate coastline could be traced back to older charts, then the illusion of discovery shattered. Europe was not pulling itself out of ignorance, but secretly relying on maps it should not have possessed. The marginal note is small, but it is enough to suggest a hidden lineage of cartography, one carefully concealed behind theology and censorship. Some scholars believe the phrase refers to documents gathered during the fall of Constantinople, or perhaps earlier, during the Crusades, when libraries were raided and manuscripts carried back to Europe. Others think the monk was working from fragments passed down in monastic vaults, copies of Greek or Arab maps that were never shared with the public. Whatever their source, the ancient charts clearly existed, and the monk's careless honesty preserved the clue. Imagine him in his cell, bent over parchment, copying coastlines by candlelight. Perhaps he was weary from hours of work. Perhaps he felt a quiet pride in knowing he was drawing from something older and truer than what his superiors admitted. In that moment, he jotted down the phrase ex antiquis chartis, never realizing that centuries later it would stand as one of the few cracks in the wall of secrecy. A whisper from the past, telling us that there was more, much more, than what the official narrative allowed. The significance of the note grows when compared with other maps of the period. Too often, the precision is explained away as coincidence or miracle, but the marginal note gives another answer. They were accurate because they were copied. The knowledge was not lost. It was guarded, translated, and hidden until the moment was right to unveil it again. That one monk's gloss has become a thread tugged by historians and skeptics alike. If one chart was drawn from ancient sources, how many others were too? If fragments of forgotten maps survived, what else lies buried in the Vatican archives, waiting in drawers marked private, never secret? Sometimes it takes only a single line of ink to unravel the fabric of centuries. The marginal note reminds us that history is not silence. It is full of whispers, and once you learn to listen, the whole tapestry begins to come undone. The medieval world was filled with pilgrims, or at least that is what the chronicles say. Monks and clerics walked the dusty roads of Europe carrying crosses, relics, and prayers, their journeys framed as acts of faith and sacrifice. But behind the hymns and holy banners, some of these pilgrimages may have carried a different purpose. Evidence suggests that at least a few were not spiritual missions at all, but covert expeditions to gather information, to survey lands, coasts, and rivers that would later find their way into hidden charts. The reliquaries they carried were said to hold bones of saints, yet some were shaped suspiciously like scroll cases, perfect for carrying rolled vellum without attracting suspicion. The church had every reason to disguise surveyors as pilgrims. A monk travelling with instruments and charts would raise questions, but a monk carrying relics was welcomed in every town. Pilgrims could cross borders, sleep in monasteries, and gain the trust of locals who shared stories of their land. A simple conversation about where rivers met or how far a village was from the coast could be written down later and quietly added to larger maps. Bit by bit, a hidden geography was stitched together under the cover of prayer. There are scattered records that support this theory. Some pilgrims' accounts contain oddly precise details. They describe distances in exact days of travel, list the number of bridges across a river, or note which harbours were deep enough for large ships. These are not the casual observations of men seeking shrines. They read like survey notes, stripped of their true purpose by the cloak of devotion. When the accounts reached monasteries, the data could be transferred to vellum maps that would never be shown to the people who provided the information. It is telling that many of the great relic routes passed through strategic locations. Pilgrimages to Santiago de Compostela cut across the Iberian Peninsula, gathering knowledge of ports and mountain passes. Journeys to Rome linked towns across Italy, building a network of roads and waterways. Even Crusader pilgrimages to the Holy Land resulted in detailed itineraries of castles, rivers, and coastlines that later surfaced in European maps. The relics were sacred, but the data they carried was even more valuable. The Vatican, always careful with appearances, could claim innocence. Pilgrims were praised for their piety, while their information quietly enriched the church's hidden collections. If confronted, officials could point to the relics themselves, holy objects that silenced questions. Yet behind those reliquaries, the rolled vellum grew thicker, filled with measurements, sketches, and coastlines centuries before they should have been known. The idea that monks doubled as surveyors may sound strange, but it fits the larger pattern. Knowledge was too valuable to be left to chance, and too dangerous to be shared openly. By wrapping maps in the cloth of faith, the Church ensured they could travel anywhere without suspicion. Pilgrims carried not only prayers but pieces of a hidden atlas, one that revealed far more of the world than history dares to admit. Whether they knew it or not, each step taken in the name of devotion may also have been a step toward charting the secret maps of the Vatican. The Jesuits were known as missionaries, men who crossed oceans to spread the faith, but they were also something more. Hidden beneath their robes, they carried compasses, quadrants, and tables of stars. Officially, they traveled to save souls, yet their missions doubled as one of the most advanced information networks the world had ever seen. Wherever they went, from the jungles of South America to the ports of China, they gathered data, recording rivers, coastlines, mountains, and the movements of the heavens. What they sent back to Rome was not only news of conversions, but pieces of a global map stitched together under the banner of salvation. Jesuit colleges across Europe trained young men not only in scripture, but in mathematics and astronomy. To preach effectively, they had to understand languages, calendars, and the skies of distant lands. A missionary in Peru needed to track the stars to align festivals with local beliefs. A Jesuit in China had to calculate eclipses to gain the trust of emperors. Every lesson they mastered became part of a hidden scientific arsenal. By the 17th century, Jesuits were exchanging star tables, navigational routes, and geographical sketches as easily as they exchanged letters about theology. The records reveal that these exchanges were not accidental. Jesuit missions acted like nodes in a web. A priest in Brazil would measure the width of the Amazon, send the data to Rome, and months later, another Jesuit in Lisbon would incorporate it into a map. A scholar in Beijing would record the exact timing of a lunar eclipse, and that observation would be compared with data from Madrid to refine global longitude. They called it the work of God, but in practice, it was a science network more powerful than any royal court or university. Why was this important to the Vatican? Because knowledge was power. By controlling the flow of information, the Church could decide what the world knew about itself. The Jesuit meridian, as some historians call it, was not a single line on a map, but a system of measuring and sharing that allowed the Church to redraw geography and time itself. If Rome knew the correct position of ports and rivers before kings did, then Rome also controlled the terms of trade and conquest. A papal bull granting land to a monarch meant little unless it was backed by accurate knowledge of where that land lay. The Jesuits provided that knowledge, quietly, under the guise of prayer. Even today, fragments of their letters survive, filled with strange combinations of devotion and data. A page might begin with praise to Christ and end with exact coordinates of a coastline. A paragraph might describe the faith of a new convert and then list the course of a river with astonishing precision. These were not contradictions, they were the very design of Jesuit missions. Faith was the cover, science the payload. The Jesuit meridian shows us that the Church did not simply stumble upon advanced maps. It built a network to gather them, to measure the world with patient precision, and to keep that knowledge within its own walls. What was presented as salvation was also survey. What was preached as light for the soul was also the measuring of the earth, and through that hidden system, the Vatican held not only heaven in its grasp, but the coordinates of the world itself. When people hear about the index of forbidden books, they imagine shelves of heretical texts, dangerous philosophies, and writings the Church did not want the public to read. What few realize is that it was not only words that were censored. Hidden alongside the famous index, there was said to be another list, never published, one that classified certain maps as periculosa exemplaria, dangerous exemplars. These were charts and atlases considered too risky to circulate, not because they contained falsehoods, but because they revealed too much truth. The idea that a map could be dangerous may sound strange, but in a world where knowledge of the earth meant wealth and power, it was more threatening than a book of theology. A forbidden book might challenge belief. A forbidden map could spark war. Imagine a chart that showed a shortcut across the ocean centuries before official discovery, or one that displayed islands rich with resources hidden from rival empires. Whoever controlled such a map held a weapon greater than any army. For the Vatican, allowing that information into the wrong hands was unthinkable. Whispers of the Index of Prohibited Cartes appear in letters between bishops and scholars during the 16th century. Some complain that their charts were confiscated for revision. Others hint that their work had been locked away under orders from Rome. A few describe colleagues stripped of their instruments after drawing coastlines that did not fit the accepted timeline. These accounts never mention the list directly, but the repeated phrase dangerous exemplars suggests a system was in place. If a map contradicted doctrine or undermined the myth of discovery, it was added to the hidden index. The most troubling part is that many of these censored maps were not destroyed, they were collected. The Church understood that knowledge, even dangerous knowledge, was too valuable to lose. Instead, it was sealed in the archives, marked private under the cover of the word secretum. Scholars were told that such maps were mistakes, products of superstition, or fabrications. But the maps themselves did not vanish. They were simply made invisible, accessible only to those with the highest authority. Think of the message this sent. To the public, Europe lived in a dark age, stumbling toward discovery. To the Church, the world was already drawn. The Index of Prohibited Cartes ensured that the story of ignorance endured, while the truth remained hidden in stone vaults. Every missing chart reinforced the illusion that explorers were heroes blazing trails through the unknown, when in reality they may have been following coastlines already inked by hands long forgotten. Today, only hints remain: a reference in the margin of a letter, a description of confiscated charts never returned, a monk's warning that certain exemplars were not to be copied. These fragments form a shadow outline of a list we are not supposed to see. The Index of Prohibited Cartes is a reminder that censorship does not always burn knowledge. Sometimes it preserves it too well, sealing it away until history itself forgets it was ever real. Step inside the great cathedrals of Europe, and you are told they are miracles of faith. Stories whisper that saints guided their construction, that holy visions showed masons where to lay stone and how to lift towers into the sky. Yet when you look closely at the floors and windows, another story begins to emerge. Patterns carved into mosaics and stained glass are not only decoration, they are coded with precise measurements of the earth itself, geodesy hidden beneath the language of miracles. Take the rose windows. To the casual eye, they are beautiful circles of colour, symbols of heaven's order. But their proportions often mirror exact astronomical ratios, alignments of sun and stars, calculated with a precision we are told did not exist in the Middle Ages. Floor mosaics, in places like Chartres Cathedral, contain labyrinths whose paths echo the curvature of the globe. Pillars align with solstices, and shadows cast by light through certain windows mark out the seasons like a sundial on a grand scale. These are not accidents. They are methods disguised as miracles. Why would such knowledge be buried in sacred architecture? The answer lies in control. To admit that builders used advanced surveying, mathematics, and astronomy would mean acknowledging a level of science inconsistent with the myth of a dark age. It was far more useful to claim that God himself guided the construction. This preserved the Church's image as the sole bridge between heaven and earth, while the real methods were hidden in plain sight. The people could marvel at the saints. The clergy could quietly use the measurements. Consider the placement of cathedrals themselves. Many stand on sites that align with older Roman or even pre-Roman surveying grids. Others connect to each other across hundreds of miles, their spires forming invisible meridians. When plotted on modern maps, these alignments form networks far too deliberate to be coincidence. They suggest that medieval builders possessed geographic knowledge, usually attributed to much later centuries. The data was real, but the story was rewritten. The miracle was celebrated, the method was forgotten. Legends of saints often served as covers for engineering feats. A tale might say Saint Denis carried his own head to the spot where a church was built. Behind the myth, surveyors had chosen a site aligned with a celestial event. A story might say a cathedral rose overnight thanks to a bishop's prayer. In reality, generations of craftsmen applied geometry so advanced it left permanent records in stone. The miracle erased the method, ensuring the crowd gave thanks to God rather than to human knowledge. When you stand on the mosaic floors and gaze up at the rose windows, you are looking at a textbook of hidden science. Ratios of the earth, measures of the heavens, calculations disguised as sacred art. These cathedrals are not just monuments of faith. They are repositories of knowledge built to survive fire, war, and time. And yet, as long as the miracles are remembered and the methods ignored, the truth remains invisible, shining through coloured glass yet unseen. On a series of old maps copied across centuries, there appears a curious shape, a peninsula that juts into the sea with striking detail. Its bays and inlets are drawn with care, its outline repeated faithfully by different cartographers, and yet no such cape exists on modern maps. Historians dismiss it as an error, a flourish of imagination, or the product of sailors exaggerating coastlines they barely knew. But the persistence of this phantom cape suggests something stranger. A landform once observed, carefully recorded, and later denied by official history. Errors on maps tend to vanish over time as knowledge improves. A misplaced island is eventually dropped, a mistaken river corrected, a mythic beast erased. But the phantom cape lingers, resurfacing on charts from the 14th, 15th, and even 16th centuries. It appears in slightly different places, sometimes on the edge of Africa, sometimes near South America, sometimes even attached to islands in the North Atlantic. Yet the similarity of its shape is undeniable. Too many scribes repeated it for it to be coincidence. What if this coastline was real when it was first seen? Rising seas, shifting sands, or volcanic destruction could have erased it from view, leaving only the memory in ink. Another possibility is even more unsettling. Perhaps the cape still exists, known to certain navigators, but removed from official charts to protect trade routes or maintain the illusion of discovery. To erase a coastline from public maps is to make it invisible to history. Sailors might whisper of it, but without coordinates it becomes legend. The Vatican had every reason to support such erasure. If a cape appeared centuries before an empire claimed to discover it, the story of divine providence guiding that empire would collapse. Better to call it an error, a phantom, than to admit that explorers had predecessors armed with forbidden charts. By branding it false, the Church could preserve the illusion that discovery was sudden and miraculous, not the continuation of older knowledge. Accounts from sailors add weight to the mystery. In letters and logs, some describe a long stretch of coast where no coast should be, with fresh water streams and dense forests. These descriptions match the Phantom Cape, but they were often struck out in later copies or dismissed as confusion. Still, the outlines remained in enough charts to show that someone saw something, and more than once. The persistence of the Phantom Cape teaches us that denial is as powerful as invention. By repeating the line across centuries, cartographers kept alive the memory of a place their patrons wished forgotten. The cape that should not exist became a quiet act of resistance, a shape too stubborn to erase. Even now, its mystery endures. Was it a lost peninsula swallowed by time, or proof of knowledge deliberately hidden? The ink says it was real, History insists it was not. Between the two lies the shadow of a coastline that may still be waiting to be found. In the margins of an old chart, a strange phrase appears, Esters Perpetua, which means perpetual summer. The words sit beside a carefully drawn coastline at the bottom of the map, a coastline that looks suspiciously like Antarctica. Yet what makes the drawing so unsettling is not its shape, but the way it is described. There are no notes of towering ice shelves or frozen seas. Instead, the scribe writes of open shores, rivers running inland, and bays that look inviting rather than deadly. According to everything we are taught, no European should have seen Antarctica until the 19th century, and certainly not without ice. So how did this image end up inked on vellum centuries earlier? One possibility is that the coastline was copied from maps far older than the chart itself. Some researchers argue that ancient civilizations may have charted Antarctica during a period when parts of it were ice-free. Geological studies show that the continent was not always frozen. Thousands of years ago, its coasts may have been green, its rivers flowing under a milder climate. If fragments of those maps survived, carried through the Greeks, the Arabs, and eventually the Vatican, then the scribe's note of perpetual summer may have been more memory than imagination. Another possibility is more controversial. Could sailors have glimpsed Antarctica during a brief moment of thaw, or misidentified another southern landmass as its coast? The problem with this theory is that the outline on the map matches Antarctica too well. Bays and peninsulas line up with modern satellite images, far beyond what guesswork would produce. To dismiss it as coincidence ignores the accuracy staring back from the parchment. The annotation itself, Esters Perpetua, raises even deeper questions. Why would a monk describe perpetual summer in a place the world knows only as endless winter? Was he copying words from a source he did not understand, faithfully recording details that contradicted his own climate? Or was he deliberately preserving a hint of knowledge the Church preferred to keep quiet, slipping it into the margin where only careful readers would notice? For the Vatican, such a chart would have been dangerous. If people learned that Europe's age of discovery was guided by maps already centuries old, the narrative of heroic voyages would crumble. The idea of unknown worlds waiting to be revealed would vanish, replaced by the uncomfortable truth that someone, somewhere, had mapped them long before. By labelling the land as mythical or misdrawn, and by sealing the charts away in archives, the Church ensured that Antarctica remained hidden until it could be rediscovered at a more convenient time. The phrase perpetual summer lingers like a riddle. Was it a poetic exaggeration, or a clue to a forgotten epoch when Antarctica's shores were green? Perhaps the answer lies still beneath the ice, waiting for the day it melts to reveal rivers that match the lines drawn by that anonymous hand. Until then, the map remains one of history's most haunting puzzles, a frozen truth wrapped in ink, whispering that our timeline of discovery may be far colder than reality ever was. When a pope issued a bull dividing the world between kings, the words carried more than spiritual weight. They carried the certainty of geography. The famous bull of 1593 split the oceans between Spain and Portugal, drawing an invisible line across lands and seas that few Europeans were supposed to know. The language was framed in theology, as though God himself granted dominion, but beneath the holy words lay something less divine. These decrees only made sense if the Vatican already possessed maps clear enough to justify such precision. Think about the audacity. How could a pope in Rome speak of lands beyond horizons no European was supposed to have seen? How could he draw boundaries over continents not yet charted? The bulls were presented as spiritual authority, yet they depended on hidden cartography. Without knowledge of coasts and islands, the line would be meaningless. But the bulls were not meaningless. They were obeyed, fought over, and used to justify wars of conquest. That means someone in the Vatican knew more than they admitted. Silence filled the space where questions should have been asked. No one dared to challenge the geographic assumptions of papal decrees. Kings and explorers accepted the bulls as binding because they believed Rome already had the knowledge to back its words. The Church never had to reveal its maps. The mere suggestion that they existed was enough to enforce obedience. The bulls became instruments of power not because of their piety, but because of the secret charts hidden behind them. Consider the Treaty of Tordesillas, signed under papal influence. It moved the line of division further west, a change that conveniently gave Portugal claim to Brazil, discovered shortly after. Was this coincidence, or proof that maps in Vatican vaults already showed the Brazilian coast? The timing is too neat, the silence too calculated. The Church never admitted to foreknowledge, but it acted with uncanny accuracy. The bulls also reveal a deeper truth about how theology was used. To the public, they were framed as moral decisions, dividing lands to prevent conflict among Christian nations. To the rulers, they were legal documents, backed by geography no one else was allowed to see. Theology rode atop cartography, like a cloak hiding the instruments of power. The words of God were spoken through the Pope, but the lines of the map were traced by men who had been erased from history. For centuries, the Vatican maintained this silence. It never explained how it could grant dominion over lands that were supposedly unknown. It never confessed to the charts that must have existed. Instead, it let kings fight and empires expand under the illusion that divine will, not hidden maps, guided their claims. The silence of the bulls is not the silence of ignorance. It is the silence of knowledge withheld, a silence that reshaped continents while pretending to speak only of heaven. And in that silence lies the greatest secret of all, that the Church did not just guide souls, it guided the very borders of the earth. In a dim archive, a chart once thought to be nothing more than a damaged portolan was unrolled for study. Its surface showed the familiar lines of the Mediterranean, ports marked with small red dots, and wind roses spreading like spiderwebs across the vellum. But where the parchment had worn thin, something unexpected emerged. Beneath the ink of the visible map, faint outlines bled through, traces of an older drawing erased but never fully gone. The discovery was accidental, yet what it revealed was far more disturbing than a simple mistake. It was a palimpsest, a chart that carried the ghost of an earlier, more accurate world. The underdrawing did not match the visible lines. Coastlines extended further, rivers were drawn with greater precision, and islands appeared in positions that suggested a deeper knowledge of longitude. The modern surface looked like a downgrade compared to what bled beneath. It was as if someone had scraped away the truth and painted over it with something more acceptable, leaving only faint scars for future eyes to glimpse. The question was not just who had made the first map, but who had decided to erase it and why. Palimpsests were common in medieval times. Parchment was expensive, so scribes often scraped off older texts to reuse the material. But this case was different. The surface map was not a random replacement. It looked deliberate, as though the older, more advanced chart had been intentionally hidden under a simplified version. The act was not about saving vellum, it was about controlling what knowledge could survive. The fact that the older outlines were more precise suggests that the flow of history did not naturally progress from crude maps to better ones. Instead, accuracy may have existed first, only to be buried under layers of sanctioned ignorance. Imagine the moment it was done, a scribe working under orders, carefully erasing coastlines that revealed too much, redrawing them to match the official narrative. Perhaps he hesitated, knowing that the older lines were closer to truth. Perhaps he whispered a prayer as he laid new ink, aware that the knowledge he concealed might never surface again. His silence was preserved in the faint bleed of the palimpsest, a testimony to secrets buried in plain sight. For the Vatican, such maps would have been dangerous. A coastline drawn too accurately could unravel the myth of discovery, showing that lands had been known long before kings and explorers claimed them. Better to overwrite the evidence, to to present charts that appeared useful yet incomplete, keeping real knowledge locked in private vaults. The portolan that bled became an unintentional witness, revealing the shadow of a world the Church did not want remembered. Today, the image of those faint lines lingers as a haunting reminder. The surface tells us one story, the underdrawing another. And between them lies a truth about history itself, that sometimes what we call progress is not discovery at all, but recovery of what was once erased. The palimpsest map whispers that the past was not lost. It was hidden, and its ghost still bleeds through the page, waiting for someone to notice. Step into the quiet of an old chapel, and your eyes are drawn to the floor. At first, it seems like nothing more than a decorative grid, a pattern of squares and circles meant to inspire a sense of order. But look closer, and the design begins to shift. The lines are not random. They match the angles of rhumb lines found on navigation charts, the same compass radiations sailors use to cross seas. What you are standing on is not just a mosaic of faith. It is a hidden map carved into stone, a secret geometry designed to record the currents of the world. Many chapels, built between the 13th and 16th centuries, contain these floor patterns. Tour guides explain them as symbols of harmony, but when compared to surviving portolan charts, the resemblance is too precise. The grids align with real compass bearings. Some even trace subtle curves that match ocean currents known to sailors centuries before textbooks admit they were discovered. Worshippers knelt on floors that doubled as navigation manuals, unaware that each prayer was offered atop lines of the sea. The secrecy went deeper. In certain confessionals, carved details reveal scales that resemble latitude markers. Thin vertical notches hidden in the wood appear meaningless until you measure their spacing. They correspond exactly to the degrees of latitude, as if someone had embedded a tool for teaching navigation inside the very place where sins were whispered. A priest could hear a confession while discreetly instructing a sailor how to find his position on the globe. Forgiveness for the soul and guidance for the voyage delivered in the same booth. Why hide such knowledge inside churches? The answer is control. Openly teaching advanced geometry and navigation risked challenging the authority of the church. If common sailors mastered the art of measuring the world, they might question the monopoly of power that defined who could claim new lands. By embedding these secrets in sacred spaces, the church ensured that only trusted individuals could access them. To the untrained eye, the grids and scales were holy symbols. To the initiated, they were tools of science, disguised as faith. This crypt geometry turns the very architecture of worship into a code. The floor becomes a chart, the walls become meridians, the confessional a hidden classroom. Monks and priests who understood the system could pass on knowledge in plain sight, safe from suspicion. If accused, they could insist the designs were symbolic, never admitting that each square of the floor and each notch in the wood carried the secrets of navigation. What is most unsettling is how widespread these designs are. Across Europe, from Spain to France to Italy, chapels carry variations of the same patterns. Some scholars argue it is coincidence, but when coincidences repeat with such mathematical precision, the explanation becomes harder to believe. The evidence suggests a deliberate network, a system of encoding maps into stone and wood, so that they could survive even if written charts were destroyed. Crypt geometry reveals that the church did not simply guard maps in dusty vaults. It built them into its houses of worship, hiding latitude and currents beneath the prayers of the faithful. Every chapel became a chart room, every confessional a compass, every mosaic a map waiting to be read. Open the life of a medieval saint, and you might expect miracles, visions, and sermons. Yet in some of these hagiographies, the details read more like the logbook of a sailor than the prayers of a holy man. Storms are described with the precision of a pilot chart. Stars are named as guiding lights, not in the vague poetry of devotion, but in the practical sequence a navigator would note. Bearings and distances slip into the text, disguised as the journey of a saint carried by divine will. These stories are not simply about sanctity, they are seamanship hidden beneath a halo. Take the legends of St. Brendan, the Irish monk said to have sailed west across the Atlantic. His voyage is framed as a spiritual quest, but the descriptions sound suspiciously nautical. He records islands of crystal, which some interpret as icebergs, and seas of fire, which resemble volcanic waters. The directions follow currents, his encounters align with known navigation routes, and the bearings he notes would have been invaluable to sailors centuries later. Yet, rather than admitting Brendan as a navigator, history remembers him as a saint carried by God's hand. The compass rose is disguised as a miracle. Other hagiographies tell of saints calming storms with prayers. Yet the timing of these stories often matches real seasonal weather patterns. Sailors would have recognized the clues. The lives of saints became coded pilot charts, passing down knowledge of seas and stars without ever calling it science. To question them was to question faith, but to understand them was to receive training. The stories worked on two levels, offering comfort to believers while teaching hidden lessons to those with eyes to see. Why would the Church encourage this disguise? Because navigation was power. If knowledge of the seas spread too freely, kingdoms might rise independent of Rome's blessing. By filtering seamanship through the lives of saints, the Church maintained control. Sailors could claim to follow the guidance of holy men rather than their own instruments. Charts could be kept scarce, while the hagiographies circulated widely, filled with symbols only the initiated could decode. The compass rose itself became a kind of relic. Early charts decorated it with elaborate designs, sometimes placing saints or angels at the points. To the faithful it was a holy symbol, but to the navigator it was a coded tool, a guide through wind and wave. In this way, sanctity masked seamanship, binding faith, and navigation together in a single image. The saints of the compass rose remind us that history often hides its truths in plain sight. What we are told are miracle stories may in fact be manuals of survival, lessons in storms, stars, and bearings preserved in the safest place of all. The holy texts no one dared to burn. The faithful saw devotion, the sailors saw directions, and the Church ensured that seamanship remained wrapped in sanctity, a map disguised as a miracle, waiting for the right eyes to read it. The story begins with a cartographer whose skill had outpaced his caution. He had drawn coastlines too precise, islands too carefully placed, rivers that matched reports the Church was not ready to admit existed. His charts, admired in whispers by sailors, reached the wrong set of eyes. Soon a letter arrived, not of praise, but of penance. He was to leave his workshop in the city and live out his days in a remote monastery where his talents could be muted beneath prayers. His instruments, the delicate compasses and astrolabes he had used to measure the world, were to be donated to the Vatican archive. Donated was the word used, though everyone knew it meant confiscated forever. The silence of exile was framed as mercy. He had not been burned, not branded a heretic, not cast into a dungeon. Instead, he was given a chance to save his soul through obedience. Yet the punishment was sharper than fire. To strip a mapmaker of his tools was to unmake him. His identity had been carved into every line of coast, every measured degree. Without his instruments, he was left to pray among walls that concealed the very knowledge he had once revealed. In the monastery, he became a ghost. He copied scripture by day, chanted psalms by night, and never again touched a compass. But the whispers followed him. The monks knew why he was there. They had seen the vellum that showed too much of the world, the lines that proved discovery had happened before it was supposed to. His name was never spoken in the archives, but his charts remained hidden among other dangerous exemplars. The Vatican preserved them not to honour him, but because erasing them entirely risked losing power. Better to lock them away where no one could see. For the cartographer, each day was penance. He remembered the voyages of sailors who had trusted his charts, the secret notes he had smuggled into margins, the precision he had pursued even when he knew it was unsafe. Now all he had was silence, broken only by the bells that marked the hours. The church called it salvation. He knew it was erasure. Stories like his were not rare. A few survive in letters, notes about talented men, suddenly transferred to monasteries far from ports, their instruments delivered to Rome for safekeeping. The pattern repeats so often, it cannot be chance. Whenever a mapmaker stepped too close to forbidden knowledge, his fate was sealed. The archive grew, the world shrank, and the cartographer vanished into prayer. The mapmaker's penance was not for sins against God, but for sins against control. His crime was drawing truth too clearly, truth that revealed what the church wanted hidden. His exile is a reminder that history is not only written by victors, it is erased by silence, by the quiet transfer of a man's life into shadows, and by the confiscation of tools that once measured the earth, but now measure only obedience. When Pope Gregory XIII introduced his calendar reform in 1582, the world was told it was a correction of time. The Julian calendar had drifted away from the solar year by several days, and the new system would realign Easter with the spring equinox. That is the official story, neat and reasonable. But hidden within the reform are clues that the adjustment was about more than feast days. The changes align not only with the sun and seasons, but with tidal cycles and eclipse tracks, suggesting that the Church may have been quietly sinking its authority over time, with data drawn from the sea and sky. The Gregorian reform was striking in its precision. 10 entire days were erased from October of that year. One day it was Thursday the 4th, the next morning it was Friday the 15th. To most people it was a mystery, accepted only because the Church said it was necessary. But the cut matched not just astronomical drift, it also corrected tidal tables used by sailors. Records show that the errors in predicting tides and eclipses suddenly disappeared after the reform, as though a secret cache of maritime data had been woven into the new calendar. This raises uncomfortable questions. How did the Vatican possess sea data accurate enough to adjust global timekeeping? Mariners of the period struggled to track longitude and predict currents, yet the reform seems to have been built on exactly that kind of knowledge. Some historians suggest Jesuit missionaries gathered the data from around the world. Others argue that older charts, preserved in the Vatican's hidden collections, already held tidal observations stretching back centuries. Either way, the decision to reshape the calendar appears less about Easter and more about anchoring human time to the rhythms of oceans and eclipses. Why would this matter? Because whoever controls time controls history. By adjusting calendars to match eclipse records, the Church ensured its chronology could not be challenged by astronomers. By syncing days with tides, it ensured that its papal decrees on navigation and exploration aligned with the practical needs of sailors. It was a way of binding theology to the mechanics of the world, reinforcing the illusion that divine authority alone had ordered the heavens. In truth, it may have been hidden cartographers and astronomers who supplied the data, their work filtered through the Vatican before the correction was announced. The Gregorian calendar still governs us today. Every date we celebrate, every year we count, carries within it the weight of that reform. Yet how many realize that their birthdays, their holidays, even their sense of when history happened, may have been shifted to fit old sea tables? The reform did not simply fix drift. It anchored our perception of time to a map of tides and eclipses hidden from the public eye. Calendars and currents are not separate realms. In 1582, they were fused, written into the very flow of days we still obey. And in that fusion lies a truth few dare to see, that our time itself may have been shaped as carefully as any coastline inked into a forbidden map. Sailors once told stories of islands that rose from the sea and vanished again, lands where fires burned beneath the waves, and forests stretched across horizons no map admitted. Historians dismiss these tales as legend, chalking them up to the fears and fantasies of men adrift too long at sea. Yet, on certain hidden charts, islands appear that modern sonar now confirms were real, not as nations, but as seamounts, ridges, and plateaus now drowned beneath the ocean. These forbidden archipelagos, drawn centuries before satellites, suggest that so-called mythic lands were once mapped with unsettling accuracy. Consider the island of High Brazil, often marked on charts west of Ireland. For centuries, it was described as a phantom, appearing in fog and disappearing again. On modern maps, it does not exist, yet sonar reveals a shallow plateau beneath those same waters, evidence that, at lower sea levels, it may have breached the surface. Old charts show it clearly, not as a vague circle, but as an island with shape and dimension. Why would cartographers draw what they never saw, unless they had sources now lost to us? Other examples scatter across the Atlantic: the Isle of St. Brendan, the Seven Cities, Antillia, and other strange clusters of land appear again and again on maps from the 14th and 15th centuries. Sailors swore they saw them, but official history later declared them imaginary. Yet, modern oceanography has revealed submerged ridges and seamounts in many of these locations, remnants of lands swallowed by rising seas. The match between sonar and old ink is too strong to ignore. Someone mapped them, and someone later erased them. The question is not whether these islands existed, but why their memory was suppressed. If charts preserved in the Vatican showed archipelagos later declared false, it means the Church chose to classify truth as myth. Perhaps it was to maintain the illusion that Europe discovered the New World by accident, guided by God, not by pre-existing knowledge. To admit that sailors already had charts of vanished lands would undermine the narrative of divine destiny. Better to call them legends and hide the vellum that proved otherwise. The Forbidden Archipelago is proof of how fragile history can be. A coastline inked on a secret chart can be rebranded as fantasy simply by keeping it from the public. An island seen by generations can be erased from textbooks with a single decree, and centuries later, when technology reveals the shape beneath the sea, the silence remains. The Vatican does not need to explain why its maps were right. It only needs to stay quiet while the world forgets. Each submerged seamount, confirmed by sonar, breathes life back into the old charts. They were not mistakes. They were memories, captured in ink by hands that should not have known such places. The Forbidden Archipelago lingers not on modern maps, but in the margins of hidden archives, where islands erased from history still wait to be acknowledged as real. Most people today accept without question that the prime meridian runs through Greenwich, England, a line agreed upon in the 19th century to standardize navigation and time. But long before that choice was made, there were other meridians, lines of zero from which maps were drawn and voyages measured. One of the most curious and least discussed lies within the records of the Vatican. Evidence suggests that the Church quietly shifted its own meridian at least once during the Age of Discovery, a subtle adjustment that redated voyages and rearranged the priority of who discovered what. The shift is not spoken of openly. It appears only in the margins of papal decrees and the hidden notes of cartographers who served under the Vatican's authority. A chart copied before the year 1500 may place its zero line through the Canary Islands, while another drawn just a generation later uses the Azores, and later still Rome itself becomes the anchor. The movement is quiet, never announced as a reform, but the consequences ripple across history. By shifting the meridian, dates of landfall could be recalculated, distances shortened or lengthened, and the honour of discovery reassigned. Imagine two explorers claiming the same island. By one reckoning, the Spanish arrive first. By another, using a slightly different meridian, the Portuguese do. If the Pope favoured one crown over the other, all he had to do was endorse the chart that aligned with the preferred meridian. To the outside world, it looked like theology. In truth, it was geometry. The Vatican had mastered the art of using invisible lines to decide the fate of continents. The meridian shift also explains strange contradictions in the records. Some voyages appear to take impossibly short times, while others drag on far longer than expected. Historians argue over errors in logs, but what if the logs were accurate and it was the reference line that moved? A voyage measured from one zero could look entirely different when recalculated from another. The adjustment was subtle enough that few noticed, yet powerful enough to rewrite the sequence of discovery. Why would the Church do this? Because controlling the meridian meant controlling time and space together. It allowed the Vatican to arbitrate disputes between empires, to sanctify claims with a geometry no king could openly challenge. After all, who would accuse the Pope of manipulating a line most people could not even see? The meridian was invisible, but its effects were concrete. It decided which monarchs ruled which lands, which voyages entered textbooks as firsts, and which were quietly forgotten. The Vatican meridian shift is a reminder that history does not always change with loud declarations. Sometimes it changes with a quiet adjustment of a line on a chart, a line that reorders events without anyone realizing it. The explorers sailed, the sailors recorded, the world turned as it always had. But with a pen stroke in Rome, their place in history could be moved, erased, or rewritten. An invisible line, drawn by unseen hands, became one of the most powerful tools of control ever wielded. In the labyrinth of Vatican records, there are hints of an order few outside ever knew by name. They were called custodes chartarum, the guardians of the maps. Their duty was not exploration, nor was it creation. It was control. Whenever a chart entered the archives, it was their hands that decided what version would survive, what details would be passed on, and what would be quietly blurred into obscurity. Their work was invisible, but absolute, shaping the world not by ships and sails, but by ink and omission. The custodes were skilled scribes trained in both theology and geometry. They copied charts with exquisite care, yet they never copied them exactly. A coastline might be smoothed, a longitude erased, an island shifted slightly off course. To the casual eye, the copy looked faithful, but to a navigator, it became useless. The true details were kept in hidden originals, while the sanitized versions were allowed to circulate. In this way, the guardians ensured that knowledge flowed only at the pace the Church desired. Longitudes were their most frequent victims. Without them, a map could not be used to measure east and west, leaving sailors dependent on Rome for guidance. By redacting longitudes or altering scales, the custodes transformed accurate charts into puzzles. A captain might follow them faithfully and still miss his destination, while a privileged few with access to the originals would arrive with uncanny precision. The guardians did not need to destroy knowledge, they only needed to bend it just enough to preserve control. Blurring coasts was another of their subtle arts. Islands became vague shapes, peninsulas shrank into points, rivers were cut short. These changes were easy to dismiss as errors or limitations of the time, but when compared across multiple versions, the pattern emerges. The mistakes were not random. They were intentional edits, designed to keep the true world hidden behind a veil of imperfection. The blurred coast ensured that discovery always seemed miraculous, never methodical. Their secrecy was protected by ritual. Each copy carried hidden marks that identified which guardian had worked on it, but only those within the order could read them. Outsiders saw only a finished map, unaware of the fingerprints of censorship pressed into its lines. The custodes chartarum operated like shadows, erasing themselves as carefully as they erased the world. Their loyalty was to the Church, not to truth. Whispers of their existence survive in scattered letters. A scholar complains that a chart he requested arrived altered. A sailor notes that the Vatican's copy of his map looked familiar, yet strangely different. In both cases, The hand of the custodes is visible only in hindsight. Their task was never to be known, only to ensure that maps told the story Rome wanted told. The Guardians remind us that censorship is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet, precise, and executed with the steady hand of a cartographer. The Custodes Chartarum did not shout their authority. They let the world believe their copies were truth, while the real coastlines slept in vaults where no one could ever sail them again. There exists in whispers a document unlike any other, a collection not of what is seen, but of what is missing. It is known by a chilling name, the Atlas of Absences. Unlike the atlases of kings or merchants, this one does not celebrate discovery. It catalogues silence. Its pages do not dazzle with coastlines and harbours, but with the evidence of erasure itself. Ports once marked on earlier maps vanish in later copies. Rivers, described in travellers' logs, flow into nothingness on the charts. Surveyors whose names should have been etched beside their work are left blank, as though the land mapped itself. The atlas does not show the world. It shows the scars of what was taken away. Erased ports are among its strangest features. On some maps of the 15th century, small harbours appear along coasts that would not be officially recognised for another 100 years. Yet, in Vatican copies, those ports are gone. The coastline remains, but the harbours are smoothed over, denying the memory of trade or contact. Were these ports too revealing of early voyages? Were they proof that Europe's age of discovery was less miraculous and more carefully staged? The atlas suggests the answer lies in what is not there. Unnamed rivers are another absence that repeats across its pages. Streams that feed entire valleys are left unmarked, even when contemporary records describe them. In some cases, the faint trace of their removal lingers, a ghostly line scraped from vellum. To erase a river is to erase the people who lived along it, their villages, their histories. The Atlas of Absences becomes not only a cartographic mystery, but a human one, hinting at civilizations deliberately left invisible. Perhaps the most haunting omissions are the unnamed surveyors. In normal atlases, even flawed ones, the makers often left signatures or marks of pride. But in the Atlas of Absences, names are systematically withheld. The charts seem to emerge from nowhere, as if the Vatican itself had drawn the world without human hand. This silence strips away accountability and turns maps into instruments of authority alone. Who charted these lands? Who sailed these seas? Their names have been erased as carefully as the rivers they once traced. Some believe the Atlas of Absences was never meant to be seen. It may have been an internal tool for the guardians of the maps, a record of what had been removed, so future censors knew which lies to maintain. If true, it is less an atlas and more a manual of forgetting, a catalogue of what must remain hidden forever. To hold such a volume would be to confront history in negative space. Each gap tells a story more powerful than any line. The Atlas of Absences is proof that erasure can be systematic, that silence itself can be drawn. And in those blank ports, those missing rivers, those vanished names, we are reminded that history is not only written by victors. It is erased by their maps, leaving behind an empty outline of a world that once was, now lost to intentional forgetting. The word inquisition often conjures images of dungeons, racks, and flames. But for mapmakers, the Inquisition came in quieter forms. It did not always arrive with shackles. It arrived with silence, with vanished patrons, with workshops suddenly closed. Cartographers who drew coastlines considered unsafe learned quickly that their careers would evaporate, their names would be stricken from guilds, and their livelihoods would dissolve without a public word of accusation. It was an inquisition of ink, not iron, but its power was just as absolute. Young mapmakers, trained with enthusiasm, eager to record the world as it was described to them by sailors. But when their charts showed islands that should not exist, or rivers flowing in directions that contradicted doctrine, their masters quietly corrected them. Those who refused to alter their work found commissions drying up. Wealthy merchants who once paid for their services were warned away. Universities denied them teaching posts. It was not torture that silenced them. It was starvation and exile, crafted so cleanly that few even realized they were watching a punishment unfold. The church rarely needed to issue formal bans. Instead, subtle signals spread through the networks of patrons and scholars. A certain mapmaker was too bold, too careless, too willing to reveal more than was safe. His work became difficult to sell, his name a whisper rather than a signature. Others took the lesson. They learned which coastlines to blur, which longitudes to omit, which lands to leave blank. Survival meant learning the invisible boundaries of cartography. The Inquisition of maps taught its lessons not with fire, but with fear of losing everything. Some of the greatest mysteries in map history stem from this quiet pressure. Why do certain regions appear so precise, centuries before official discovery, only to become vague in later copies? Why are names of surveyors missing, or their lines suddenly crude? The answer is not incompetence. It is the hand of censorship. The cartographers knew what not to draw, just as much as they knew what to draw. Their silence became a second language, one enforced by the unspoken rules of the cartographic inquisition. Occasionally, a defiant mapmaker resisted. A few dared to ink forbidden coastlines anyway, slipping them into margins or decorating them as monsters and legends. These coded rebellions allowed some fragments of truth to survive, but most surrendered, learning to trade accuracy for safety. Their world was defined by what they could not risk showing, and in that sense, they became prisoners of their own craft. The cartographic inquisition is rarely named in history books, but its mark lingers in every atlas. The gaps, the omissions, the strange hesitations on coastlines all testify to its shadow. No torture chambers were needed. A mapmaker only had to lose his patron, his guild, or his position, and the lesson was learned. In this way, the Inquisition of maps achieved what whips never could. It bent not just the hands of cartographers, but the very shape of the world they dared to draw. It began with water. A library in Portugal flooded after a violent storm, and as the staff rushed to salvage soaked manuscripts, they uncovered a chest long forgotten. It was heavy, bound in iron, stamped with a faded insignia of the Jesuit order. Inside, wrapped in layers of waxed cloth, were documents unlike anything catalogued in the library before. Charts with wind roses spiraling across oceans, pages of star positions written in elegant Latin, and maps of a world that did not match the one taught in catechism. The trunk from Lisbon contained fragments of a knowledge system both familiar and alien. On one vellum sheet, the southern constellations were drawn with such precision that they matched modern astronomical charts. Yet according to official history, Europeans were not supposed to have documented them until centuries later. Another folio showed wind patterns across the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, clearly indicating seasonal monsoons and trade winds that only long experience at sea could reveal. These were not speculative drawings. They were working tools, the kind sailors relied on to cross oceans. Most unsettling were the maps themselves. Continents were sketched with outlines that contradicted the neat, incomplete forms shown in published atlases of the 16th century. South America stretched further than it should have. Antarctica appeared without its cloak of ice. Even more curious, Africa's interior was laced with river systems, unknown to official charts, but later confirmed by modern geography. Whoever compiled these maps was not guessing. They were recording a world in ways that clashed directly with the story of discovery taught from the pulpit. The Jesuits were known for their global missions, carrying both faith and science across continents. They studied the stars in China, measured rivers in South America, and compiled reports for Rome. But the Lisbon chest suggested they preserved far more than they admitted. The trunk's contents hinted at a secret tradition within the order, one where knowledge was meticulously gathered, organized, and hidden when it threatened doctrine. What was allowed to circulate in universities and churches was only a fraction of what lay in their archives. Why hide such material? The answer lies in the contradictions. If the world had been charted so accurately centuries earlier, the Church's story of divine providence guiding explorers would collapse. The myth of miraculous discovery would be replaced with the reality of suppressed knowledge. The Catechism taught that humanity emerged from darkness into light under the Church's guidance. These maps told a different tale, one where the light had always been there, hidden under lock and key. After the flood, the trunk was quietly removed, catalogued under restricted access, and never displayed to the public again. Only fragments were described by those who handled it, whispers carried through academic gossip. A world that contradicted catechism had surfaced, only to be sealed once more. The Lisbon chest reminds us that sometimes history does not need to be destroyed. It only needs to be kept in a trunk, in a basement, waiting for water or accident to reveal the truth that institutions still fear to acknowledge. On the surface, it looked like nothing more than an ornate cartouche, the kind of decorative title block common on Renaissance maps. Angels flanked the edges, ribbons curled around Latin text, and symbols of faith were woven into its design. To most viewers, it was a flourish of beauty meant to sanctify the chart it adorned. Yet hidden in those curves was something no decoration should carry, a cipher that when solved whispered the names of sources the Church had spent centuries denying. The cartouche did not glorify God, it confessed. The discovery came when a scholar noticed that the Latin lettering seemed oddly inconsistent. Certain letters were drawn with exaggerated curls, while others were compressed. At first it appeared to be a quirk of style, until the pattern repeated with mathematical precision. When the letters were counted and rearranged, a list began to emerge. Names of Greek authors banned as pagan, references to Arab geographers accused of heresy, even hints at Chinese scrolls long thought unknown in Europe. The cartouche was not merely a title, it was a hidden bibliography, etched into ornament so that only the curious would see. Such ciphers were not unheard of in the Middle Ages. Scholars who feared censure often hid their references in marginal notes or symbolic drawings. But to embed them in a cartouche on a Vatican-approved map was daring, almost reckless. Whoever did it must have known the danger. Yet perhaps he also knew that beauty itself was the best disguise. No inquisitor would suspect that angels and vines concealed forbidden names. The very decoration that proclaimed piety became the mask for rebellion. What the cartouche revealed was devastating. If the mapmaker truly drew from sources the Church denied, then the accuracy of his work depended on knowledge officially condemned. This meant that when the Vatican praised the map as proof of divine order, it was in fact praising information it had worked hard to erase. The Church wanted the product but not the credit, the chart but not the chain of knowledge behind it. The cipher was the mapmaker's way of reclaiming that truth, a confession smuggled through ornament. The list itself was short, but each name carried weight. Claudius Ptolemy, whose geography was both used and suppressed. Al-Idrisi, the Arab scholar whose maps had charted Africa and Asia with striking clarity. A Chinese record marked only as Tabula Cathay, suggesting Jesuits were not the first to bring that knowledge west. These were not accidental references. They were the foundations of the chart, carefully acknowledged in secret while denied in public. The cartouche that confessed reminds us that truth often survives in the margins, hidden where authority least expects it. A flourish of ink, a curl of ribbon, a decorative block at the edge of a map can carry more weight than the chart itself. The Church could erase names from official texts, but it could not strip them from the ciphered cartouche without admitting it had something to hide. And so the confession endured, silent, ornate, waiting for eyes willing to read what was never meant to be spoken aloud. The Renaissance is often told as a story of sudden rediscovery. a miraculous reawakening after centuries of darkness. Ancient texts are said to have been stumbled upon in forgotten libraries, maps, and knowledge, somehow lost, are said to have been recovered just in time to ignite a new age. But when the timeline is examined closely, the rediscoveries look less like accidents and more like carefully staged unveilings. The right maps appeared exactly when the Church needed them, surfacing at moments of crisis to reinforce its image as both guardian of truth and gatekeeper of progress. Take the case of Claudius Ptolemy's geography. Supposedly lost for centuries, it suddenly re-emerged in 15th century Europe, just as exploration began to accelerate. Its maps and coordinates transformed the way scholars viewed the world. But why then? Why not earlier, when its insights could have advanced navigation long before? The timing was too perfect. As kingdoms prepared to expand overseas, the Church could step in with the gift of ancient knowledge, reminding rulers that without Rome's vaults, they could not sail forward. The same pattern holds for portolan charts. These maps of the Mediterranean and beyond seem to appear from nowhere in the late medieval period, astonishingly accurate compared to the symbolic T and O maps of earlier centuries. They were praised as marvels of practical seafaring, yet their precision suggested they were based on far older surveys. It was as if the Church had been holding them in reserve, waiting for the moment when unveiling them would reinforce the narrative that the Renaissance was guided by divine timing. The logic becomes clearer when tied to politics. Each release of hidden knowledge coincided with a need to reaffirm papal authority. When rival kingdoms argued over who had the right to new lands, papal bulls were issued, backed by maps that suddenly appeared to provide certainty. When scholars doubted the Church's intellectual leadership, forgotten manuscripts were brought to light, proving Rome had always been the true guardian of wisdom. The rediscovery narrative was not about truth, it was about image. For ordinary people, the story was inspiring. Humanity, guided by God through His Church, had awakened from ignorance to light. But beneath the surface, it was less awakening and more choreography. Knowledge had not vanished, it had been sealed, and when the time was right, it was released with fanfare, ensuring that credit flowed to the Vatican rather than to the anonymous scribes and sailors who had preserved it all along. The Renaissance by release reminds us that history can be scripted as carefully as theatre. The curtain rises, the actors appear, and the audience gasps at the miracle of rediscovery. Yet behind the curtain lies a vault filled with props, maps, and texts waiting for their cue. The Church did not simply preserve the light of knowledge through the so-called Dark Ages. It controlled the spotlight, deciding when and how that light would shine, ensuring that the stage always illuminated Rome at the center of the world. Beneath the polished story told in history books lies another version of the world, one inked on vellum and sealed in vaults. It is the world behind the world, a geography that does not match the maps we are taught to trust. If the hidden charts are correct, then the very structure of church history rests on an edited foundation. Missions, papal bulls, and triumphs take on new meaning once you realize they were built upon coastlines and continents already known but never acknowledged. Consider the papal bulls that divided the New World between Spain and Portugal in the late 15th century. To issue such decrees with authority, the Pope would have needed certainty about where one land ended and another began. Officially, this was guided by divine inspiration and reports from explorers. But the precision of the boundaries suggests access to maps far more detailed than those available to the public. If those maps existed, then the celebrated voyages were less about discovery and more about confirmation of what the Church already knew. The same holds true for missions. Stories describe brave clerics venturing into unknown lands to spread the gospel, guided only by faith. Yet missionary routes often followed paths too efficient to be accidental, as though the missionaries carried charts that pointed them directly to rivers, ports, and native settlements. Their journeys were framed as miraculous, but the hidden maps suggest they were calculated. Faith may have been the banner, but geography was the engine. Even the triumphs of the Church take on a different shade when seen through this lens. Victories over rival powers, the establishment of new dioceses, the timing of councils, all align suspiciously with the appearance of geographic knowledge at just the right moment. History tells us the Church guided the faithful through mystery and revelation. But if the hidden maps are true, then much of that guidance was staged, based not on miracles, but on information withheld until it served the right purpose. This edited geography is more than just a collection of coastlines. It is the scaffold on which centuries of belief and authority were built. If a coastline was erased, a miracle could take its place. If an island was hidden, its sudden appearance could be framed as divine providence. If a river was omitted, its later revelation could be claimed as proof of the Church's guidance. The geography was not merely recorded, it was scripted. The unsettling truth is that the world we think we know may be only the surface. Behind it lies another version, drawn with lines that contradict official history yet align with modern science. That world was never lost. It was concealed. And the Church's greatest strength was not in creating it, but in deciding which version humanity was allowed to see. The world behind the world still waits in silence, reminding us that history itself may stand on coastlines carefully erased and rediscovered only when those in power needed them most. For centuries, whispers have circled about what lies locked in the Vatican's map drawers, shelves upon shelves of vellum and parchment, sealed away from the eyes of the public, guarded by rules so strict that even seasoned scholars must beg for limited access. The official excuse has always been preservation, that fragile charts could not withstand careless handling, but preservation has become indistinguishable from censorship. The time has come for a demand not whispered but spoken clearly. Open the drawers. Let the world see what has been hidden. The tools exist now to uncover truth without destruction. With modern science, inks can be tested to reveal their age. Parchments can be analysed without damage, proving once and for all whether coastlines were drawn centuries earlier than official history admits. Star fixes, scribbled in margins, can be compared to modern astronomical software, pinpointing exact nights when a navigator recorded the heavens. Rivers, ports, and coastlines can be cross-checked against satellite data. For the first time in history, we could let the world date itself again, not through dogma, but through evidence. Why should this matter? Because the story of humanity is chained to geography. If coastlines were charted long before explorers claimed them, then the tale of discovery collapses. If forgotten rivers were drawn accurately, then entire civilizations erased from memory rise back into history. If Antarctica was sketched ice-free, then questions about lost ages and advanced knowledge can no longer be ignored. The maps have the power to rewrite not only the history of the Church, but the history of the world. Those who resist argue that secrecy protects faith, that to expose every chart is to expose doubt. But faith that cannot withstand truth is not faith at all. If the Church truly believes in its role as guardian of knowledge, then what greater act of guardianship could there be than to share? Hiding maps in darkness does not preserve them, it preserves ignorance. Opening the drawers would be an act not of rebellion, but of renewal. The manifesto is simple. Let scholars enter, let them work without restriction, let them test, photograph, compare, and publish. Not with the oversight of clerics who decide which fragments may be seen, but with the freedom of science itself. The Vatican does not own the past, humanity does. The maps are not relics of one institution. They are memory, and memory belongs to us all. To open the drawers is to open the world again, to peel back centuries of silence and let history breathe. Every coastline, every erased island, every ciphered cartouche deserves daylight. It is time to stop accepting excuses. Time to demand transparency. Time to let the world date itself again and finally discover whether the story we have been told matches the story inked long ago by hands that saw more than we are allowed to know. I drew what I saw. That is how the voice begins, whispered in the candlelight of a cloister where stone walls echo every word. The anonymous monk does not name himself, because names can be erased. He speaks instead as a witness. He tells of days spent bent over vellum, quill in hand, tracing coastlines described by sailors, sketching stars exactly where he had seen them in the cold night sky. He worked with devotion, believing that to map creation was to honor its maker. Yet each chart he finished was carried away, sealed behind stone doors, never to be seen again. He recalls the smell of ink, the rhythm of tides he calculated by candle flame, the way his fingers stiffened in the winter chill while drawing rivers that he knew men would one day follow. He remembers the joy of seeing the world take shape beneath his hands, a joy shadowed by fear. For each time he set down his quill, the abbot would come, lift the parchment gently, and disappear with it into the archive. The monk prayed it was for safekeeping, but in his heart he knew it was for silence. His prayer becomes a confession. He tells how he once drew a chain of islands beyond the horizon, carefully recorded from a shipwrecked sailor who had stumbled home with stories too detailed to be lies. The islands were real, but when the map was taken, they vanished. In their place, in the version sent to others, the ocean lay blank. He felt the wound of that absence more deeply than any lash of penance. To erase a land was to erase its people, its history, its place in creation, and he was made complicit. The voice trembles as he admits he asked God for forgiveness, not for drawing, but for letting his drawings disappear. He had seen rivers where others swore there were none. He had charted a coast that would not appear in public for another century. He had measured the stars, and the stars had told him truths that the pulpit would never allow. He begged that one day the world might see what he had seen, that his lines might outlast the vault that swallowed them. His prayer ends not in anger, but in hope. He believes that maps are more stubborn than censors, that lines drawn in faith will one day find their way back into the light. He cannot name when, or how, or by whom. He can only whisper into the silence of his monastery, trusting that truth cannot be buried forever. I drew what I saw, he repeats, softer now, as if to reassure himself. And though the stone closed around it, though the drawers swallowed it whole, I know the world remembers. Somewhere, someday, someone will open the map again, and in that moment, the silence I endured will break, and the world will see the prayer I left written in ink. History is usually told in words, in the pages of chronicles, in the sermons of priests, in the declarations of kings. But there is another language, older and just as powerful, a language of lines. Coastlines that curve across vellum, rivers that thread through unknown lands, stars fixed in ink above a black sea. These lines do not lie. They tell us where people once sailed, what they once knew, and how far they once reached. And yet, for centuries, those lines have been redrawn, erased, or hidden until the world we study is only half of what once existed. If we want the truth, we must not only read the words handed down to us, we must redraw the world itself. The compass, that small circle of metal and needle, was once a symbol of navigation, of daring, of stepping beyond the horizon. But it is more than that. It is a symbol of honesty. The compass points where it will, unmoved by doctrine or decree. It cannot be bribed, silenced, or erased. To follow it is to accept reality, no matter how inconvenient. That is why the final call is not to the archive, not to the pulpit, but to the compass. Only by following it can we find the lines that reveal the world behind the world. If the hidden maps are opened, if the drawers are finally unlocked, the story of history may fracture. Discoveries celebrated as miracles may be revealed as manipulations. Voyages cast as firsts may prove to be seconds or thirds. Civilizations dismissed as primitive may rise again as the forgotten masters of knowledge. It will not be comfortable. It will not flatter the powers that built their image on secrecy. But it will be true. and truth has always been the first compass by which humanity finds its way. We are told to trust the smooth narrative, the neat sequence from Rome to Dark Ages to Renaissance to modernity. But smoothness is the mask of editing. Real history is jagged. It is full of contradictions, accidents, and inconvenient brilliance that blooms in the wrong century. The lines of old maps remind us of this. They show us islands erased from memory, coasts charted too early, stars measured with impossible precision. They whisper that the story we know was written atop a geography already edited. The only way forward is to redraw those lines, to let them speak without censorship. So let the call to the compass be heard, not to abandon faith, but to separate it from control, not to shame the past, but to free it from silence. Every coastline inked in secret, every river erased, every cartouche that confessed deserves to be seen. The compass waits, steady and unbending, ready to guide us beyond the narratives we inherited. History is not finished, it is a map still being drawn. And if we have the courage to follow the lines, we may yet read the Church anew and finally rediscover the world as it truly is.